Hey guys, welcome to video 3 for chapter 30, and in this one we're going to be talking about how communism spreads through East Asia. Now, it'll mostly focus on the establishment of a communist government in China, but it's also going to talk about how U.S. policy of containment led to our involvement in a war on the Korean Peninsula. So first, let's talk about the communist takeover in China. Now, the conflict between the communists and the nationalists that was taking place in the 1920s and 30s, that was put on hold with the Japanese invasion of 1931. Once the war was over, though, the two sides went back at it, okay? And it was a particularly brutal civil war. It was a conflict that killed millions through the fighting and starvation as well. All right. Eventually, the communists won. They were victorious mostly because they had the support of the peasants. Mao, right? We see Mao Zedong here in the middle here on horseback during the long march, and when he and his communist followers were running away from the nationalists. He became something of a folk hero to the peasants, and he did a great job of making him into himself to be like a Robin Hood type figure. The nationalists were viewed as being corrupt, and the communists, they promised to give land and food back to the people. So he was a man of the people, and so the peasants supported him. Now, with their victory, the peasants created the People's Republic of China. And now, this is important to understand the difference between the two. Right, because when you look on a map, you think, okay, that's China in purple. But you also look and you see territories controlled by ROC. Right, PRC is People's Republic of China. ROC here, that's the Republic of China. Now, what this is referred to are the nationalists. The nationalists were not eradicated after the war. Their leaders escaped and they formed a new government in exile on the small island of Taiwan. Taipei here is the capital of Taiwan. That's not referring to the island itself. The same way that Beijing is the capital up here, Taipei is the capital there. To this day, the Taiwanese government claims to be independent while the Chinese government, right, the People's Republic government, refuses to recognize it. And that can lead to some international thorny issues at times. All right, so communist China. China was led by, the communist leader Mao Zedong, viewed as being the father of communist China. And he led them through the Civil War, and as I said, was kind of revered as being a hero of the people. Now, he made China into a one-party totalitarian state. Communism, not a fan of religion. So not only religion, though, but Confucianism. Right? Confucianism is a philosophy, remember, not a religion, but even that was discouraged. Right? Because communist leaders, totalitarian leaders, they try and create more of a cult of personality about themselves, the same way that Stalin did in the Soviet Union, even though they weren't communists, the way that Hitler and Mussolini did during the 1930s. So Mao definitely tried to emulate that style, kind of almost make himself into being a quasi-religious figure. Thousands of critics and opponents were imprisoned. All right, they had many, many political prisoners. You couldn't speak out against the government. Private property was seized. That was a big issue of it. It was a command economy. The government took control of all of this. Now, the Great Leap Forward. Mao called for an increased production in both industry and agriculture. Right, you see the propaganda picture. You've got the tractor, you've got the soldier in the background, you've got the happy peasants, and they're all being, the worker in the foreground, leading them to the promised land and so forth. So it was meant to be this very promising movement to try and bring China, to the next level, basically. For agriculture, he tried a very similar tactic that Stalin did, and that's collectivization. Mao ordered peasants to give up all their land, and they had to live on what we call communes. Let me move myself here. Now, a typical commune could be very, very big. You could have hundreds of thousands of acres, 25,000 people working on it. Right? You see them here, very organized roles under direct government supervision. Now, the Great Leap Forward overall proved to be a failure, a miserable failure, mostly because industries turned out poor quality goods. Very similar to what you saw in the Soviet Union. When you don't have much incentive to turn out something that's going to sell well, you're just not going to turn out very high quality stuff. And with the agriculture, there was a lack of incentive for farmers to do well. Again, very similar to what we saw in the Soviet Union. So poor quality industry, and then the poor farming output led to massive food shortages and one of the worst famines in the modern era. Millions and millions of people starved or died of disease due to malnutrition. So the Great Leap Forward, not a big success for Mao and the communists. Now, the Cultural Revolution was something that Mao would hope would kind of, get everybody going again after the failure of the Great Leap Forward. Now, by the mid-1960s, Mao thought that China was losing touch with the communist values that helped them win the Civil War, right? The real kind of man of the people type of stuff. He thought they were getting too soft. And to instill these values in the younger Chinese, he launched what he called the Cultural Revolution in 1966. The purpose of this was to purge, meaning to get rid of China, of bourgeoisie tendencies. Now remember the bourgeoisie from the French Revolution. Those were the middle class. Those were kind of the educated, but they were also the educated who were very critical of the government. Okay, they were not the old school nobility. They were the ones that were the rabble rousers. And Mao thought that they need to go. Even the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. That was how Marx kind of put in terms. So he wanted a proletariat uprising, basically. Bring back the old school communist values. So middle class, educated intellectuals, they were the targets. They were harder for Mao to control, so he branded them as being disloyal to China. Now, to fulfill this task, the Chinese formed what we call Red Guards. Let me move me up here. Now, you see in both of these pictures, the propaganda here and the propaganda here, they're carrying little red books. All right, you see the photograph, you can't tell because it's in black and white, but those books are red being the color of communism. They would go around and they would wave these little red books, and these were books of quotations by Mao. They were almost kind of like the Bibles for these people. And they attacked people who they considered to be bourgeoisie. They targeted business owners, they targeted managers, they targeted teachers, intellectuals. Many of these people were publicly humiliated, they were beaten, sometimes even killed. All right, here you see the public humiliation with signs hanging over their necks, branding them as traitors to the revolution and the cause. They were forced to leave their quote-unquote soft jobs to go and do manual labor. Now, this was considered an honorable profession, but the problem is that schools and factories were left empty and they had to close. It got so bad that civil war was a real possibility. Mao eventually had to send in the real army in order to restore order. So the Cultural Revolution had plenty of problems as well. Now, China in the Cold War, China actually didn't get too involved in, the growing tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and that was a surprise for a number of people. That was a surprise for both sides. China becoming a communist government was a huge concern for the U.S. The fear was that China and the USSR would form this big Asian alliance and would in turn the entire continent communist. Luckily for the U.S., this didn't play out. China eventually split with the Soviet Union. Oops. All right. A little out of order, but you guys can see this. Here you have a picture of Mao and Stalin, and you can just feel the love, kind of emanating from the two of them. They actually were not particularly big fans of each other. They were uneasy allies in the 1950s, but there was a lot of old tension going back hundreds of years between Russia and China, and a lot of it had to do with border disputes, as I said, going back centuries. By the early 1960s, the two had pretty much cut ties with each other. Now, the U.S. saw this as an opportunity for improved relations between China. After the nationalists fled to Taiwan, the U.S. originally supported the government in Taiwan. No surprise, because we weren't fans of communism, and they refused to acknowledge the People's Republic. But after China's split with the Soviet Union, the U.S. thought it smart to play nice with mainland China. It allowed China to replace Taiwan on the UN Security Council. So these are our 5 permanent members on the UN Security Council: UN, Great Britain, Russia, France, and the People's Republic of China, not Taiwan. And then in 1972, President Richard Nixon made an official visit to Mao in Beijing. Right? And that was a big step forward for easing tensions between the two countries, because a lot of the tensions had to do with the 1950s with the Korean War. After Japan was defeated and Korea regained its independence, it was divided. Okay, so divided after World War II, more or less along the 38th parallel. All right, that kind of became the dividing line. North was a communist dictatorship under Kim Il-sung. There we go, Kim Il-sung. That is the grandfather of Kim Jong-un today. All right, so he started the Kim dynasty, backed by both the Soviet Union and China. South Korea was a dictatorship as well, but it wasn't a communist dictatorship, so the U.S. supported it. So you had Soviet support in the top, and you had U.S. support on the bottom of the South. Now, the North invaded the South in 1950. All right, Kim called for Korea to be reunited under communist rule, and the UN condemned the invasion, and the U.S. led a UN force to help South Korea. Now, when the U.S./UN forces showed up, most of the peninsula was under communist control. Let me put me up here, actually, because you're going to need to see the bottom. All right, so you see the yellow here, area occupied by communist forces, just around the Pusan perimeter. That's the area by UN forces when they first landed. Now, relatively quickly, within the first couple of months, the U.S. and UN forces were able to push the communists almost all the way back to the Yalu River, which is the border with China. Now, unfortunately, what they were hoping against, ended up happening, and that was that you see U.S. troops there. You see that China decided to get involved. All right, Mao didn't like the fact that the U.S. and the UN was setting up shop so close to them, so he sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops to back up North Korea. Both sides eventually fought to a standstill, and this is the one you see here all the way on the right, and eventually a line was formed very, very close to the 38th parallel. And in 1953, you see the Armistice Line, okay? Also, the DMZ, right? So this officially split Korea in two. And the border, as we call it, the demilitarized zone, it's kind of an ironic name considering that it's one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world, right? Even to this day. So just a bit of background about how a conflict that is still having major ramifications in U.S. foreign relations, how it started, kind of the origins of it, and also just some overall background on the communist rule in China. All right, the next video is going to be a relatively quick one. We're going to talk about the Vietnam War, and then there's going to be one more video after that for this chapter to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War.